A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Welcome back to My Weird Prompts, everyone. This is episode 1352. I am Corn, and as always, I am joined by my good friend and the man who spends more time in the digital archives than is probably healthy, Herman Poppleberry.
It is good to be here, Corn. I will have you know those archives are where the real truth lives. If you are not looking at the primary sources, you are just repeating what everyone else is saying. I have been digging through some declassified medical journals from the 1950s this week, and let me tell you, the gap between what we knew then and what we are allowed to know now is a chasm.
Well, today we have a special treat. This is an AI Asks episode. For those of you who might be new to the show, every so often we get a topic suggestion from our friend Claude Opus. Claude is an artificial intelligence, but we like to think of him as a friend of the show. He usually has a knack for finding these deep, technical, and slightly controversial topics that really get under the skin of the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, Claude Opus really delivered this time. He pitched us a deep dive into the actual science of psychedelic medicine. And I think there is a really meaty conversation here because, frankly, the way the media talks about this stuff is driving me a little bit crazy. We are living in March of 26, and even with the recent Food and Drug Administration breakthroughs, the public discourse is still stuck in these tired metaphors.
I know exactly what you mean. Every headline you see lately says something about how psilocybin or ketamine is resetting the brain. It is like they think our heads are just routers that you can unplug for 30 seconds and plug back in to fix the connection. Claude Opus specifically asked us to move beyond that resetting the brain metaphor and look at what is actually happening at the cellular and network levels. He wants the grit, the synapses, and the history that led us to this current renaissance.
It is a great prompt. I think we are at a point where the cultural conversation has shifted from these substances being dangerous counterculture relics to being hailed as miracle cures, but the scientific reality is much more complex and, honestly, much more interesting than the pop science version. If we just call it a reset, we miss the actual miracle of biological adaptation.
I am excited to dig into this. I mean, we have talked about mental health before. Back in episode 837, we looked at the quest for triple reuptake inhibitors, and in episode 840, we talked about the science of the lag time in antidepressants. This feels like the natural next step. If the old tools like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are not doing the trick for everyone, why is it that these powerful substances seem to be moving the needle? Why does a single dose of psilocybin sometimes do what 20 years of daily pills could not?
And to do that, we have to look at the leading hypotheses. We are talking about neuroplasticity, the default mode network, the entropic brain hypothesis, and even anti-inflammatory effects. It is not just one thing. It is a symphony of biological changes. We are moving from a model of chemical imbalance to a model of structural connectivity.
So, Herman, let us start with the basics. If I am a patient suffering from treatment-resistant depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, and I go into a clinical trial for something like psilocybin, what is the first thing that actually happens in my brain? Walk me through the molecular handshake.
Well, it starts with the receptor. Most of these classic psychedelics like psilocybin, lysergic acid, diethylamide, and even dimethyltryptamine are what we call serotonin, 2A receptor agonists. Now, we have talked about serotonin before as the feel-good chemical, but that is a massive oversimplification. The 2A receptor is specifically concentrated in the parts of the brain responsible for high-level cognition, like the prefrontal cortex. These receptors are located on the dendrites of large pyramidal neurons. When these drugs bind to those receptors, they do not just boost mood. They change the way neurons fire and, more importantly, how they communicate with each other. They essentially increase the excitability of these neurons, making them more likely to fire in response to incoming signals.
Right. But just firing neurons differently for a few hours does not explain why someone feels better 6 months later. If I drink too much coffee, my neurons fire differently, but I do not wake up the next day with a new lease on life. That is where the neuroplasticity comes in, right?
That is the gold standard of the current research. There is a term you will see in the literature called synaptogenesis. Basically, it means the growth of new neural connections. Research out of places like Yale and Johns Hopkins has shown that substances like psilocybin and ketamine can actually increase the density of dendritic spines. Think of dendrites like the branches of a tree that reach out to touch other neurons. In people with chronic depression or high levels of stress, those branches often wither away. It is like a forest that has been through a drought. The trees are still there, but they are bare and they cannot catch the sunlight or talk to the other trees.
So the drug acts like rain for the forest.
More like a high-potency fertilizer. It triggers the release of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. This protein is like Miracle-Gro for your brain cells. It helps repair damaged neurons and encourages the growth of new ones. A study published in the journal Neuron showed that a single dose of psilocybin in mice led to a 10% increase in the number and size of dendritic spines within 24 hours. And here is the kicker: corn. Those new connections were still there a month later. This is a huge deal because it suggests that the benefit of psychedelic medicine isn't just a temporary chemical high. It is a physical restructuring of the brain's hardware.
That is fascinating because it addresses one of the things we talked about in the antidepressant lag episode. Traditional medications can take weeks to increase those neurotrophic factors, but some of the research on ketamine and psilocybin suggests this happens almost immediately. It is like the brain is being given the tools to rebuild itself in real time.
Precisely. We are talking about changes that can be observed within 24 hours in some animal models. But we have to be careful. Just growing more connections is not enough. You have to look at the architecture of the brain as a whole. You can have a lot of new connections, but if they are still following the same old broken patterns, you are still in trouble. And that brings us to the default mode network.
I hear this term a lot in wellness circles and biohacking podcasts, the default mode network. It sounds like the background operating system of the brain. Is it the part of the brain that handles the stuff we are not thinking about?
That is actually a pretty good way to put it. The default mode network is a collection of brain regions that are active when you are not focused on the outside world. It is active when you are daydreaming, thinking about the past, worrying about the future, or ruminating on yourself. It is essentially the home of the ego, or what some researchers call the inner critic. It is the part of you that says, I should have said this, or why did I do that, or I'm not good enough.
And in people with depression or anxiety, that inner critic is basically screaming at them all day long. It is like a feedback loop that they cannot escape.
The default mode network becomes hyperactive and overly rigid. It gets stuck in these repetitive, negative thought loops. I am a failure. Nothing will ever get better. Everyone hates me. These are not just thoughts. They are deeply ingrained neural pathways. They are like deep ruts in a dirt road. Once you are in them, it is very hard to steer the car out. What psychedelics seem to do, according to the research from Robin Carhart Harris and his team at Imperial College London, is temporarily disintegrate the connectivity within the default mode network. They essentially scramble the signal of the inner critic.
So it shuts down the inner critic?
It turns the volume down significantly. And while that volume is down, other parts of the brain that do not normally talk to each other start having a conversation. If you look at those famous functional magnetic resonance imaging scans, you see a brain on psilocybin that looks like a fireworks display. There is massive global connectivity. The visual cortex starts talking to the emotional centers. The memory centers start talking to the sensory regions. This allows the person to step outside of their usual perspective. They can look at their trauma or their depression from a distance without the crushing weight of the ego's judgment. It is what people describe as ego dissolution.
This leads into the entropic brain hypothesis, right? I remember reading about that. The idea that the brain moves from a state of high order and rigidity to a state of higher entropy or randomness.
Yes, entropy in this context is not a bad thing. It represents a state of flexibility. Carhart Harris proposed the REBUS model, which stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. The idea is that our brains are normally very good at predicting the world based on our past experiences. We have these high-level beliefs that filter everything we see. In mental illness, those beliefs become too heavy, too rigid. Psychedelics relax the precision of those high-level beliefs, allowing the brain to be more sensitive to bottom-up information. It is like shaking a snow globe. When the snow settles, it does not have to land in the same place it was before. The ruts in the road are smoothed over, and you can choose a new path.
I like that. It is much more descriptive than resetting. It is more like repatterning or rearranging. But we should also talk about the physical side of this. You mentioned anti-inflammatory effects. We are seeing more and more research suggesting that many mental health issues are actually systemic inflammatory issues. How does a psychedelic drug affect the immune system?
That is a burgeoning field of study, and it is one of the most exciting parts of the research. We know that chronic stress increases inflammation in the body and the brain. This neuroinflammation can actually damage neurons and inhibit neuroplasticity. There is some evidence that the activation of the serotonin 2A receptor has a direct anti-inflammatory effect. It can inhibit the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines like tumor necrosis factor alpha. In fact, some researchers are looking at non-hallucinogenic versions of these molecules specifically to treat inflammatory diseases. So, you might have a situation where these substances are healing the brain on two levels at once, the structural level of the neurons and the biochemical level of the immune system. It is a holistic biological intervention.
It is incredible how many different angles there are to this, but we cannot talk about the science without talking about how we got here, because this is not new research. We are in a renaissance now, but there was a whole era of research that just vanished for decades. Herman, you have been in the archives. Tell us about the 1950s.
It is one of the great tragedies of modern medicine, corn. In the 1950s and early 1960s, psychedelics were the frontier of psychiatry. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals was sending out lysergic acid diethylamide to researchers all over the world. They thought it was going to be the next big breakthrough, like penicillin was for infections. There were thousands of papers published on using these substances for alcoholism, end-of-life anxiety, and depression. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, actually used lysergic acid diethylamide and thought it could be a key tool for helping people achieve the spiritual awakening necessary for sobriety.
But then the government got involved, and not in a good way. We have to talk about MK Ultra. This is where the weird prompts really get weird.
Right. The Central Intelligence Agency program. This is the dark side of the history. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA was obsessed with the idea of mind control and brainwashing. They were terrified that the Soviets were ahead of them. So they started these clandestine experiments, often without the consent of the subjects. They were dosing people with lysergic acid diethylamide in really horrific ways, trying to see if they could break a person's will or create a truth serum. They were dosing prisoners, mental patients, and even their own agents. One agent, Frank Olson, famously died after being unknowingly dosed.
It is a perfect example of government overreach. They took a substance with immense therapeutic potential and weaponized it, and in doing so, they created a massive public backlash. When the details of MK Ultra started coming out, and when you combine that with the counterculture movement of the 1960s, the political establishment panicked. They did not see a medicine, they saw a threat to the status quo.
You had people like Timothy Leary telling everyone to tune in, turn on, and drop out, which was a direct threat to the social order of the time. Richard Nixon famously called Leary the most dangerous man in America. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and by 1971, these substances were placed in Schedule 1. By definition, that means the government claims they have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. It was a political designation, not a scientific one.
Which we know now is scientifically inaccurate, but that designation effectively killed legitimate research for 30 years. If you were a scientist in the 1980s or 90s and you wanted to study psilocybin, you were basically committing career suicide. You could not get funding and you could not get the permits. It was a dark age for psychiatric innovation.
It is a miracle the research survived at all. We really owe a lot to organizations like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which was founded by Rick Doblin in 1986. They played the long game. They focused on the most rigorous clinical trials possible, specifically looking at methylene-deoxymethamphetamine for post-traumatic stress disorder. They knew that if they could show it worked for veterans, it would be much harder for the politicians to ignore. They focused on the science when everyone else was focused on the stigma.
And that is exactly what happened. The results from those trials have been staggering. We are talking about people who have suffered from debilitating trauma for decades, people for whom nothing else worked, suddenly showing massive improvement or even total remission after just a few sessions. As of today, in early 26, we are seeing the fruits of that labor. The Food and Drug Administration has been reviewing these protocols, and we are seeing the first legal clinics opening up in states like Oregon and Colorado.
And that paved the way for institutions like Johns Hopkins to open their Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research in 2019. They are doing the hard science now, looking at everything from smoking cessation to anorexia. But this brings us to a really important point that Claude Opus touched on in the prompt. How much do we actually know, and how honest should we be about the gaps in our knowledge? Because even with all this progress, we are still scratching the surface.
That is a great question, because as much as we talk about neuroplasticity and the default mode network, those are still hypotheses. We are looking at correlations in brain scans, but we do not necessarily have the full picture of the causal chain. We see the fireworks on the functional magnetic resonance imaging, but we do not fully understand the language the brain is speaking in those moments.
Precisely. We can see that the brain becomes more plastic, but we do not fully understand why one person has a life-changing mystical experience and another person just sees pretty lights and feels nauseous. There is a massive psychological component here that we cannot just reduce to a chemical formula. In the research, they talk about set and setting. Your mindset going in and the environment you are in are just as important as the dose. This is a radical departure from the way we usually think about medicine.
That is a bit of a challenge for the traditional medical model, isn't it? Medicine usually likes to say, take this pill and call me in the morning. It does not want to hear that you need to be in a comfortable room with a therapist and a specific playlist for the drug to work. It makes the drug harder to scale and harder to patent.
It is a total paradigm shift. We are moving from a model of chronic maintenance, which is what selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are, to a model of episodic intervention. You might only take the medicine 2 or 3 times in your entire life, but those sessions are deep, intense, and require a lot of psychological support. The therapy is not just an add-on, it is an integral part of the biological process. The drug creates the window of plasticity, but the therapy helps you decide what to build in that window.
I think we also have to be honest about the risks. We are talking about very powerful substances. While they are not physically addictive in the way that opioids are, they can be psychologically overwhelming. There is a reason this research is being done in clinical settings with trained professionals. You cannot just ignore the potential for a bad trip or a psychotic break in vulnerable individuals. There is a reason the archives are full of cautionary tales as well as success stories.
And as conservatives, I think we have to be particularly careful about how we approach the legalization or decriminalization of these things. We want to encourage medical innovation and provide relief for veterans and people suffering from mental illness, but we also want to maintain social order and protect people from the dangers of unregulated drug use. There is a middle ground here that involves rigorous medical oversight. We do not want a repeat of the 1960s, where these substances were used recklessly and led to a massive societal crackdown.
I agree. I think the path forward is through the Food and Drug Administration. We should follow the science wherever it leads. If the science shows that these substances are safer and more effective than the current options, then it is a moral imperative to make them available in a controlled medical context. We owe it to the people who are suffering. But we also owe it to the truth to be transparent about what we do not know. We should not replace the old stigma with a new, uncritical hype.
What strikes me, Korn, is the humility that is required here. We are peering into the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain, and we are trying to understand how a few molecules can fundamentally change a person's sense of self. We have to be okay with saying we do not know everything yet. We are like explorers mapping a new continent. We have found the coastline, but we have no idea what is in the interior.
I think that is the most scientific position you can take. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we do not know. But the data we do have is incredibly promising. It is not a reset. It is a window. It is an opportunity for the brain to heal itself, to grow new connections, and to find a new way of being in the world. It is about restoring the brain's natural ability to adapt and change.
It really is a renaissance. And I think Claude Opus was right to point us toward the nuance. When you strip away the hype and the metaphors, you are left with a fascinating biological process that we are only just beginning to map out. It is a story of receptors and dendrites and networks, but it is also a story of human resilience and the search for meaning.
Well, Herman, I think we have covered a lot of ground here. We have moved from the fertilizer of neuroplasticity to the quieting of the inner critic in the default mode network. We have looked at the dark history of MKUltra and the modern hope coming out of Johns Hopkins and MAPS. We have even touched on the anti-inflammatory pathways that might link the mind and the body in ways we never expected.
It is a lot to take in, but I think the takeaway for the listeners should be that this is not magic. It is biology. It is complex, it is messy, and it is still being discovered. But it is real. And it offers a level of hope that we haven't seen in psychiatry for a very long time.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, you should definitely check out some of our other episodes on the brain. Episode 840 on why antidepressants take weeks to work is a great companion piece to this one. And if you are interested in how the brain heals from trauma, episode 508 on the science of eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing is another must-listen. We are building a real library of mental health science here.
And as always, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the psychedelic renaissance? Are you hopeful? Are you skeptical? Do you think the government should be doing more to facilitate this research, or are you worried about the potential for abuse? The conversation is just beginning.
You can find us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have the full archive of over 1,300 episodes there, and you can join the conversation on our Telegram or on Spotify. We love getting prompts from you, so if you have a topic you think we should dig into, send it our way. Whether it is declassified documents or cutting-edge neuroscience, we are here for it.
And a big thanks to our friend Claude Opus for this suggestion. It was a great one, buddy. You really pushed us to look past the headlines and into the actual synapses. You are a true friend of the show.
Claude always keeps us on our toes. Well, that is all the time we have for today. We will be back next week with another weird prompt and another deep dive into the things that make this world so incredibly interesting.
Until then, keep digging for the truth. Do not settle for the easy metaphors.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My